started with that leper who came to Jesus and said, God, if you're willing, you could heal me. Not are you able, but are you willing? And when we look at that leper, we actually can learn a few things about a healthy theological view on when it comes to healing. And it's kind of interesting because we're talking about healing. Well, on Wednesday in our theology, Bible study, that's what we talked about. God is a healer. And, there's just certain things that we can kind of make sense of, but there's other things that we don't. Like, why does God heal some people and not others? These are things that we don't know. When do we pray for healing and when do we not pray for healing? Is there a process that God uses? And there's so many things that we just don't know. But what we can learn, especially from the leper, is this. The leper knew Jesus as a healer. He knew that. He pondered this. Was it in Jesus' sovereignty and authority to heal him? And the third thing is this. He knew that if he was going to be healed, he had to reach out to Jesus. That's what we know. So how did Jesus respond to this man and his response to him? And I love it. I love Jesus' response. We're told that he touched him. He physically touched a man who, for who knows how long, had not been touched. And what we know is that for the first time in a long time, this man was touched. And in that touch, he felt the healing power of Jesus. Not just physically, but I also believe emotionally and spiritually as well. He felt a touch that was full of compassion, full of love, and yet full of power at the same time. And what a touch. This touch cured him of his leprosy, reversing the decay, and brought about a physical healing. So much so that people could notice it. Truth tells us this. At some point, our bodies will die, and they will decay. It's going to happen. I woke up this morning to snap, crackle, and pop. That's my new wake-up routine. It's like, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, I know most of the body parts, but I didn't know those body parts existed. You know what I'm talking about? Like this part here hurts, this part here's cracking, this one here's popping, and I'm trying to figure out what are those and why is this happening to me? But yet, eventually we'll die and eventually we'll decay, and no amount of faith will ever change that. Yet, what faith in Jesus reminds us of is that even if God doesn't always heal, he is still the healer. That will never change and is always leading us through the redemptive process of healing or walking through us in the midst of the hardships if we don't get healed. So regardless if he heals us or not, what we do know is that Jesus will always be with us. And so as we try to make sense of brokenness, may we remember that we need to come to Jesus like the leper, trusting that Jesus is the healer, asking God, is this in your sovereignty and is this in your authority? But if not, I'm just going to continue to come. We come with a posture that says, if it's in the realm of your sovereignty and on your authority, God, then please heal me. But if not, give me the grace to keep going. So let's look at what the king touches and what happens when the king touches hopeless lives and how he does that today. And so the first thing that we're going to see is in Matthew 9, verses 18 through 26. And when the king came touching, what we're going to see is that the king became unclean. 2 Corinthians tells us that he who knew no sin became sin on our behalf that we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus became our sins when he died on the cross. He took them away. He bore them. In essence, Jesus became unclean on our behalf. And we read this here in verse 18. While he spoke these things to him, behold, a ruler came and worshipped him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. So Jesus arose and followed him. So did his disciples. Now, in Luke chapter 8, we get the same, the same record of the same account, just with more details to it. Luke tells us that this man's name was Jairus, and he was a ruler in the synagogue. So he was a religious ruler in this synagogue. Now, what we need to understand is, how did synagogues come about? Where did they start from? What's their origin? Now, what we know is that before 586 BC, most Jews lived within 100 miles of the temple. That's where they would go and they would worship. That's where they would go and they would bring their sacrifices. And that's where they met with the living God. But in 586 BC, the Jews were carried away to Babylon, where they lived as exiles for 70 years. They were exiles in Babylon. They were unable to worship in the temple at that point in time. And so what they did is they established synagogues in neighborhoods that had 10 or more Jewish men in them. So synagogues began to pop up. Each synagogue had 10 leaders, and they were called elders. And one of those was elected to be their rulers. It was in the synagogue that what they would do is they would come and gather and worship and study scripture that was usually brought to them by this one ruler. The ruler of the synagogue was considered an important man, and he was in charge of the synagogue. He's the one that made sure everything ran the way it was supposed to. He would also settle civil disputes within the neighborhood, so they would call him in if there was issues amongst the people. He had power, prosperity, influence, and impact in the community. Jairus was this man. And the interesting thing is, we already know that the rulers of the synagogues were looking for reasons to get rid of Jesus. Jesus was shaking things up. They were not comfortable with him. And so for Jairus to come to Jesus, you know what he was doing? He was putting his position as ruler of a synagogue in jeopardy. He was risking everything to come to Jesus. And why did he do it? Because his child was facing death. But what does he say to Jesus? He says, "Come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." Now, if you really consider what he was asking, you would know that really what he was asking is, Jesus, are you willing to become unclean to heal my daughter? Because if you had touched a dead body, you would be unclean. And you'd have to go through the ceremonial process of cleansing. That's what he was asking. And Jesus knew this very well, and he was still willing to go with him. Showing us that sometimes things don't always go the way we thought they would or hoped they would, but that's what this guy's going to face. Because on his journey to heal this little girl, Jesus is interrupted. Goes on, verse 20. And suddenly a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she had said to herself, "If only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well." But Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, "Be of good cheer, daughter. Your faith has made you well." And the woman was made well from that hour. So picture this. Here Jairus is. He's walking with Jesus. They're going to Jairus' house. They're on a journey. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Jesus stops. He stops. He turns around and he sees this woman. And he begins to talk to her. Begins to have a conversation with her. And this woman could really teach us a few things. Especially when it comes to those moments in our lives where we don't feel like we feel Jesus' presence or his touch in our life. And we're wondering, is he really there? You see, there's going to come times in your life where that's how you feel. You're going to feel alone. You're going to wonder, is Jesus really still there? It's in those moments that, like this woman, we need to respond the same way she did. We need to seek Jesus and touch him. We need to reach out and grab a hold of the hem of his garment. We need to stop waiting in those moments, and we need to pursue him. How do we do that? Through the reading of his word, through fellowship, through breaking the bread, Through worship, through prayer, we reach out to him. We do it from a place of brokenness, like this woman who Luke tells us for 12 years she had this issue going on with her. Was her theology correct? If I could just touch the hem of his garb, I'll be healed. No, her theology wasn't correct. Was her knowledge complete? No, she didn't have a complete understanding of how everything worked. She was actually acting in superstition. If I could just touch the hem of his garb. But I love Jesus' response. Or I should say, I like how he didn't respond. You see, Jesus didn't say, since your theology is all messed up, I'm not going to help you. No, what did he say? Be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well. Her incomplete, kind of messed up faith was still faith in the one that could heal her. He heard her cry, even though her theology was not right. Charles Spurgeon said this. He said, she was ignorant enough to think that healing went from him unconsciously, yet her faith lived despite her ignorance and triumphed despite her bashfulness. I just love that. Because what we see here is that God honors people who in desperation seek to touch him. God honors that. Luke informs us that this woman had tried many physicians to heal her, but none could. Luke tells us also that she spent everything she had. So you could imagine her despair, the place where she was coming from. She was in despair. She was discouraged because nothing seemed to be able to change her situation. The hopes that she had were all shattered. Her resources were gone. Do you feel that pain? Have you ever been there? Have you ever been in that place where when you look around, you just have nothing left? And unless Jesus intervenes, you're going to be stuck in a place of despair. But how many of our stories are this? That in those places, from those places, Jesus always shows up. That at the end of the day, Jesus is glorified and Jesus does what only he can do. What's fascinating to me is this. You have Jairus, who's hopeless. You have this woman who is hopeless. Two opposite people on two opposite ends of the spectrum. Jairus a ruler, this lady not. Two opposite people. He felt the brokenness. Hey, buddy. Love it. He's smiling now. He got, you want to come up here? He wants to preach. That's it. But here these two people are. And where did they meet? But at the feet of Jesus. Because at the feet of Jesus, we're all on a level playing field. Doesn't matter where we are, where we've come from. Jairus, a leading Jewish man, and she was an anonymous woman with no prestige or resources. Jairus was a synagogue leader while her affliction kept her from worship. Jairus came pleading for his daughter. This woman came with a need of her own. This girl had been healthy for 12 years, the same 12 years that this woman had been dealing with this issue and was healed. Jairus' need was public. Everybody knew about it. But this woman's need was private and only Jesus understood. Both Jairus and this woman trusted Jesus and he met their needs. Jairus could have resented her because what we know is that when Jairus showed up, the girl wasn't dead yet And he got message later on that she had died while Jesus was delayed because he was ministering to this lady. He could have resented her because she kept Jesus from getting to his daughter before she died. But Jairus' real problem was not the woman stopping Jesus. What God knew is that Jairus needed to hear this woman's story. Mark tells us that Jesus forced the woman to give her testimony, to tell her story. You see, the fact that God helped others ought to encourage us and trust him. Encourage us in our faith. So we shouldn't be so selfish in our prayers that it keeps us from waiting on the Lord, knowing that he is never late. We need to trust him. You see, it's not the strength of our faith that saves us, but it's our faith in the strong Savior. Verse 23. When Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing, he said to them, "Make room, for the girl is not dead but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when the crowd was put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl rose. And the report of this went into all the land. I love how Jesus works. You see, the laughter, the scorners, the mockers, they all had to be moved out before Jesus would go in. He got rid of them. You see, sometimes we need to move out the mockers in our lives so that Jesus can work. And once out, Jesus took her by the hand, and she rose from the dead. So our message to the hopeless is this: that Jesus was and is still willing to become unclean that he might touch people's lives. That's the gospel. The second thing that we're going to see is this. We're going to see the king's merciful touch. Verses 27 through 31. It says, when Jesus departed from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out and saying, "Son of David, have mercy on us." And when he had come into the house, the blind men came in to him. And Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" And they said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes, saying, "According to your faith, let it be to you." And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, saying, "See that no one knows it." But when they had departed, they spread the news about him in all the country. When I got to verse 31, the end of verse 30, I just laughed. I just thought it was funny, just the wording of it. I'm thinking to myself, did Jesus do this on purpose? Here's these 2 blind guys who just get healed, and he says to them, "See that no one..." I just thought it was funny. Like, just the wording. It's like, they're blind, they can't see, but see. I don't know. Maybe it's just my sick and twisted head. But what I do know is this: it's not easy for blind people to follow Jesus. It's not easy for blind people to follow anybody. I mean, we have that term, the blind leading the blind. That phrase, and people are like, and in my head I'm picturing them just going around in circles. I mean, I don't know. They had to rely on someone to follow Jesus. But they did. They relied on someone. They followed him. And what did they say? They said, "Have mercy on us." I think that's interesting. They didn't even ask him to heal their blindness. They asked for mercy. They asked for mercy. And then Jesus said, "Do you believe I'm able to do this?" Do what? To be merciful. Do you believe I'm able to be merciful to you who are blind? Their response was, "Son of David." And that's a title for the Messiah. And it's interesting. You see, these three blind men actually had better vision than anyone else because they saw Jesus as the Messiah when everybody else was trying to figure out who he was. They understood it. We often ask this question, well, how did these guys become blind? As if that's important. How did that happen? We don't know. But here's what I want to tell you. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it was a disease or sin or if it was an accident. It doesn't matter. What does matter is this. As they acknowledged Jesus as the Son of David and followed him into the house, their faith was what brought about a healing to their sight. But their faith was really what brought mercy to their lives. And God was merciful to them and opened their eyes so that they could see and be healed. You see, chapters 8 and 9 are all about all these miracles that have taken place, these healings that had happened. In verse 10, we have the centurion who had great faith. In verse 26 of chapter 8, we saw the disciples in the storm had little faith. Interesting. We looked at, in chapter 9, verse 2, we looked at the faith of the friends who ripped off the roof and dropped their friend down. In 9, verse 22, we saw the woman who had been healed. Jairus' faith was tested by a delay along the way. And here these blind men had their faith rewarded. And the healing of the blind was proof that Jesus was the Messiah, according to Luke 4:8 and Isaiah 61:1 and 2. Talked about when the Messiah come, this is what he would do. The blind would see. Again, Charles Spurgeon, he said this. He said, the sole appeal was to mercy. There was no talk about merit, no pleading of their past suffering or of their persevering endeavor or their resolve for the future, but have mercy on us. He will never win a blessing from God who demands it as if he has a right to it. When we come to God, we don't come to him saying, God, you owe me, don't you know? No, we all come from this place and this need for God to be merciful. And as we go out into the world, our message to the hopeless, our message to everybody is this, that Jesus was and still is willing to show mercy and be merciful. And he's willing to do it in such a way that he's willing to touch those who are hurting. And he does that through you and I. And the last thing that we're going to see revealed is the king's compassion in verses 32 through 38. In verse 32, and they went out. Behold, they brought to him a man mute and demon-possessed. And when the demon was cast out, the mute spoke. And the multitude marveled, saying, it was never seen like this in Israel. But the Pharisees said, he casts out demon by the ruler of demons. Where do they come up with these things? I mean, it's like, I just picture it. They're like, I can't explain it. It's because of the ruler of the demons. Man, how crazy is this? But in able to understand this fully, what you need to understand is this. Jews believed that if you were mute because you were demon-possessed, there was no way you could be healed of demon possession. And they believed that because what rabbis were teaching, most of the rabbis in the day were teaching this, that the first step in exorcism was to get the demon to tell you its name. Because if you could know the name of the demon, then you would have a handle in which to remove him out of the person. So you had to know their name. And so if the guy couldn't speak, you couldn't hear the demon's name. And if you didn't have the demon's name, this guy was stuck in this state of demon possession for the rest of his life. This guy, the demon had made him mute, which would have prevented him from revealing the name of the demon, therefore preventing exorcism. So to say he felt hopeless would have been an understatement, so much so that he couldn't even express how hopeless he felt. But what I love about Jesus is this. he had no problem with the demon. He was able to cast him out of a guy who couldn't speak. Jesus didn't need to know the demon's name. And he healed the guy. Think about what being mute and hopeless would have been like for this guy. I mean, just think about it. He wasn't deaf. He could hear what everybody was saying about him. He could hear how people, looked at him and like, oh, no, we got to stay away from that guy. He heard all the conversations. He knew what it would take to be able to have a little bit of hope that a demon could be removed from him. But somebody brought him. Somebody wasn't willing to listen to the crowd. Somebody believed that even being mute wasn't going to hinder Jesus from touching his life. And Jesus delivered him. And the people said, well, this is a new thing in Israel. This is something new. The religious leaders would not admit that Jesus was Messiah. They couldn't. They were kind of now in a dilemma. And so to answer what happened, they said, well, he did it because of went to the guy who oversees the demons and working for the other team. Yeah, it's crazy. But we have a message to the hopeless. And that is this, that we're willing to come alongside you and bring you to the one who could set you free. Because he's still willing to be compassionate, even if it doesn't seem like it could be possible. But it goes on in verse 35. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitude, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered, like sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest. Jesus shows us a couple things here. He shows us that he is a God of compassion. He was moved with compassion because the people were like sheep without a shepherd. But the other thing that he shows us is that he saw what was going on as a harvest that is plentiful. That people are looking for and longing to meet the shepherd of the sheep. That Jesus is the one that people are actually seeking, even though they may not know it. And I believe what Jesus is doing here is he's inviting us to see what he saw and feel what he felt, so that we would then be able to do what he did. So the next time you turn on the news and you see discouraging stories, the next time you open your social media feed and it's just, bombarded with all this craziness and hurt and hopelessness, what Jesus is saying is, look at it how I see it. Be moved with compassion. See them as sheep without a shepherd, but also see it as a harvest that is plentiful. That God himself is praying and having people pray that workers would go into the field and reap a harvest that is plentiful. Because isn't that what marks the life of a disciple? That we do what Jesus did? The word used for move with compassion in the Greek is splat. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. It's really weird spelling. But it means that it's the strongest word for pity in the Greek language. That's what it is. It describes the compassion which moves a man to the deepest depths of his being. It's a compassion that is moved to action. You know, Jesus didn't argue with people, but he was willing to help those who would receive him. He preached the gospel of the kingdom, verse 35. The good news. The good news that hasn't changed. The good news that is still good news today in our generation. It's the good news that people still need to hear. Not only did he preach the good news, but then he sent out his disciples to preach that same gospel. And it's that same gospel that he is trusted to us to preach today. Because people are still in need of a shepherd. And we get the privilege of bringing them to Jesus. But as I listen to what Jesus said, and I hear the brokenness that comes from his mouth, that described, I believe, the heart that was broken for the people that were without a sheep, or sheep without a shepherd. The answer to this question is of what broke his heart was this: the neglected flock and a harvest going to waste for lack of reapers. But if we put it a different way, it would sound like this: Jesus' heart broke for hurting people who were being neglected by a broken religious system that isn't moved with compassion and not seeing people like Jesus sees them. That's what broke Jesus' heart. That people weren't willing to touch people. Well, they're unclean. That didn't stop Jesus from touching them. And then he says, pray for the laborers, that God would send out laborers. And I want you to know this: the laborers that have been prayed for throughout the centuries, today that's you and I. You and I are the answer to some grandmother's prayer who was praying for her grandson. For some broken mom's heart who is praying for her child. For some neighbor who loved his neighbor. You and I are the answer. And all God is asking us is to have our heart break for what broke his. The answer isn't a fixed religious system. It's this. It's us having our hearts broken and bringing a gospel that is willing to touch somebody's life, especially when they feel like they're not even touchable. Our message to a hopeless people is the gospel of Jesus' kingdom. It's the same message that Jesus preached. It's the same good news that says that Jesus was and still is willing to send people into the harvest to have compassion on the hopeless. Guys, our world is full of brokenness. It is all around us. Our world is full of people that don't even know that they're broken, but they still have needs, like Jairus. Bottom line is, our world is still full of people that need Jesus. And you and I get the opportunity to introduce people to Jesus. So remember, today, it's you and I. It's our turn. Well, if I just knew a little bit more, if my theology was just a little bit more correct, well, how did that work for the lady with the issue of blood? Her theology wasn't correct, but that she knew that Jesus was able. Those things will get sorted out after time. But what people need is to know that Jesus is willing to touch their lives, to walk with them, to meet them in their questions. Jairus probably wondered, well, why did Jesus stop for her? And we'll never know the answer, but what we do know is that Jesus continued to walk with Jairus and still dealt with the problem. To the blind guys who just asked for mercy, he gave them sight. To the demon-possessed guy who couldn't speak, he removed the demon. And to the sheep who were without a shepherd, he became that shepherd. And then he sends us with that same message to introduce those sheep to their shepherd. You see, Jesus is inviting us to do what he did, but we must be willing to touch people's lives just like he touched ours. And I believe this, when we do that, that's when we will see revival begin to take place. Because what we will see is Jesus showing up through our faith into the lives of people that need Jesus to be a part of their lives. That's what discipleship is. It's not just knowing what Jesus knew, but it's doing what Jesus did. And so I want to leave you with this question. Are you willing to touch people like Jesus did while introducing them to Jesus, who is ultimately the healer that can ultimately intervene in whatever their situation is? The harvest is plentiful. The workers are few. There's moms, dad, grandmas, sisters, brothers, people that have gone before us, praying for you specifically to be those workers, to go into the harvest, to meet their family members who are broken and hopeless, to bring the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the good news that says he is willing and able, that he is the healer.